I'm going to talk about the Sponge Park, which is a project that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with and have probably seen bits and pieces of this presentation, but as I was talking about at lunch, it kind of changes every time I talk about it. So the idea of this park was to create an open space around the Gowanus to absorb surface water runoff, because we know how beautiful the Gowanus can be on a nice day, but also that it has these degraded edges. And that this is the site of the Gowanus Dredgers Boat Club, which is also where we're going to be doing this pilot project. The boat club used to be in that nice shipping container, which has unfortunately been removed, but there'll be a new home, right? So the Gowanus is an interesting area. It used to be a swamp. In 1776. The hydrology or the shape of the landscape looked very different. And it's transformed over time to become this industrial waterfront. And you can see that, the streets were quite full, but that if you look at the current plan, there are still a lot of there are now a lot of vacant properties. And a lot of this landscape has actually been paved, and there's a serious issue of all this surface water runoff going across this landscape, and it has nowhere to go. So it goes down to the street ends, and it carries with it a lot of sediment and a lot of oil and garbage, and that all gets deposited down at these street ends. And you also have on the surface of the water over here, you can see right over here. That's actually the raw sewage sitting on the top of the Gowanus Canal. So again, these are issues that you're all familiar with. It's kind of funny talking to an audience that knows it all already. But our premise with this project was to create more absorptive surfaces. And so we're really working in section a lot, thinking about what the ground is made of and how we can enhance the permeability of that soil. But we were also adding a lot of program along the way, or the idea was to basically layer the program elements over a more productive absorptive landscape. So the idea you can see represented here in this rendering with the walkway actually going over this water absorbing landscape. So I call this a new paradigm of a way of working. It may be kind of crazy, actually, in retrospect, but because we've been working on this project for about 8 years, but it all started with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy, who approached us and said, hey, will you help us? We want to come up with some way to manage the surface water runoff and make public space in the Gowanus. We want to make green roofs. We want to add rain barrels. We want to just improve the area. And what can we do? And we said, and then they said, well, but we don't have any money. And we said, that's okay. We'll help you get grants. And so we helped the Conservancy write a grant for NISCA, and that paid for some of the initial planning. And that planning helped to produce documents that we then presented to City Council. And City Council, I know Steve was here, I don't know if he ducked out, but our City Council people at the time, now it's Lander and Levin, but then it was de Blasio and Yaski, and they actually put forth about $700,000 to do a first project. We also, along the way, ended up applying for a grant from the New England Interstate Water Pollution Control Commission, because while the City Council could fund the construction, they couldn't fund our design services without a competitive process. So my firm ended up writing a grant, and we got this big chunk of money from NWIPIC. Along the way, we also we reached out to a lot of different community groups. We worked with the Dredgers, we worked with the Center for Urban Pedagogy, trying to get input on the project. And then we also recognized that there were going to be maintenance issues down the road. And so we found another grant from the Department of Environmental Conservation, which is a state agency, to develop a maintenance manual. Now, we have had the funds and we have this thing in draft form, but we haven't completed it because we're waiting to actually do the final construction so that the maintenance manual reflects the plants that are actually in place. Because it's really fundamental. It shows like this is a clipper, and this is the plant, and this is how you take care of it, right? So it's very basic and easy to use. But then for the construction, we ended up having a shortfall in the construction budget, so we found another grant And this one was from the state, from the Environmental Facilities Corporation, who gave the additional $500,000 to finish the project. So the entire thing has been funded by grants. So that's why it's a new paradigm. I'm not saying it's something to follow necessarily, but the great thing is that I think it's led to an innovative new prototype for how to deal with street ends in the city. And that's, I think, kind of a big deal, like actually just establishing a new kind of infrastructure. So we have this pilot project at Second Street, and you can see the Batcave site across the way, which I think Lee talked about this morning, that we're collaborating on. But you know, when we started the work, one of the big issues was that Department of City Planning was recommending Esplanadia, as you refer to it, for the Gowanus, and you know, that's all well and good. And we were saying, okay, if you're going to propose Esplanadia, we really should have a 40-foot setback rather than a 20-foot setback to try to maintain a lot of the openness of the Gowanus area, because I think that's a big characteristic of the neighborhood. But I think the other issue that we recognized was that there were a number of blockages. You know, the industrial waterfront was designed with buildings that go up to the edge of the water to facilitate that exchange, right? You'd offload your goods into buildings. And that could be a problem, or that is a problem for Esplanadia, but it's, I love that term, but it's actually kind of an opportunity, or we took it as an opportunity for us to say that rather than having only a waterfront edge that sort of privileges those waterfront properties, why not create an entire district that's all about the stormwater management and actually thread these paths back into the neighborhood and have those be these green infrastructure paths. So you're creating a whole green district. So this was the idea, the green district, an urban promenade versus an esplanade. You could have these whole sort of walkways, and they're not actually going to be orange. That was just to highlight the area. It's not the yellow brick road. So, you know, one of the early studies we did, or early aspects of the work, was suggesting that the Batcave could be a really amazing environmental and cultural center, and happily, you know, the philanthropist bought the property, and that's what he's doing with it. And then, even happier for us, he hired our, dlandstudio and Lee Weintraub to work together on it. So it's been an amazing experience actually working with Lee on that project. An early supporter of the project was Nydia Velasquez, our congresswoman, and we made this rendering for her because she was proposed to by her husband on the banks of the Gowanus. I kid you not. So this was our ode to Nydia. But this pilot is actually at Second Street, which you know is right next to the Lightstone project. And we worked with Weidlinger Engineering, with Montclair State to do monitoring, and with CUP and with the Gowanus Canal Conservancy. Now, we're no longer working with Montclair State because the scientist we're working with has moved to another university, so we're still working with him. But in any case, what we did was, the reason we chose Second Street was because we calculated the amount of water that was going down all of the streets in the Gowanus and determined that Second Street actually had the most, and so we could have the greatest impact there. You know, this is the Lightstone site, and happily, the Toll Brothers group had already done a ULURP process on the Toll Brothers site, and what that meant was that there was this landscape that was available for us to use. And what I mean by that is that this zone had already been designated as a shore public walkway, so there was 50 feet of public right-of-way, and so our sponge park actually occurs within that zone. If the ULURP hadn't happened, we wouldn't have been able to do the sponge park. So, you know, we're benefiting from that project in some ways. So again, we did the calculations of how much water was going to come down the street, and we also have these upland bioswales up here, and those capture more of the water from the upper area. One of the things that we discovered was, you know, we had the intention of keeping water out of the combined sewers, but it turns out all these street ends have direct drainage. So the stormwater that's coming down in these upland streets, those go into the combined sewers, but these don't. But they still carry with it all that detritus. So, you know, it's still very beneficial. So we we did very specific calculations to really figure out the efficacy of each piece of the project. And we built it in a modular way. We looked at the potential for phytoremediation within the bioswales, using little blue stem, switchgrass, red fescues, a lot of blue flag iris and flame grasses, and then some plants that were specifically geared toward heavy metal accumulation as well. So this is the layout plan. We had to remove some existing green streets, which are shown with the red outline. But you can see we're really working within that public walkway access area. Now, this is my favorite diagram, and I talk about it a lot, but it just shows how incredibly complicated the Gowanus area is. And it got even more complicated with the Superfund, but the sediment underneath the canal is actually controlled by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and now the Superfund. It's a navigable waterway, so it's controlled by the Army Corps. The first 5 feet of soil on the upland areas is controlled by the Department of Environmental Conservation. The surface of the ground is controlled by the Department of Transportation, because we're dealing with a roadway. And then all the plants are controlled by the Parks Department. The water that flows over the ground is controlled by the Department of Environmental Protection. The shade over the water is controlled by the DEC. And then, of course, you have all of the very, 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 very specific rules of the Department of City Planning in relation to waterfront design, like this waterfront esplanade design. And those are long and very involved. So we managed to come up with this design that actually conforms to all of these different rules. But in the middle of doing that, the area was designated an EPA Superfund, and we were a little bit worried that this would complicate the project. But as it turned out, it didn't, because the Superfund is really only dealing with sediment underneath the canal, and they don't really have as much jurisdiction on our sites. But what was a little bit complicated from a jurisdictional standpoint was getting the Public Design Commission approval. And this is something that not everybody who isn't an architect or from a public agency or landscape architect knows about. But the PDC has very specific opinions about what can happen in the public realm, and it's a very valuable resource actually for the city. But we put together this materials timeline looking at the different street ends. So all of these could have sponge parks eventually, hopefully. But what you see is that there isn't really a pattern in relation to, say, where the cobble is, or where the asphalt is, or where the plants are. So what we did was, when we went to the PDC, we said, okay, there is no pattern, but there are these materials that are out there, and what we're going to do is just reorganize them. And so they bought that, they liked that, but they also said that we had to maintain a lot of this cobble. So this is actually our prototype of what it's going to look like, and I have a video to end. This is 2 minutes long, but I think it really explains the whole thing the best. If I can get this to, there we go, okay. All right, so this is the existing condition, the green streets. So we're taking those out because they have curbs. We're going to reuse some of the plants on another site. So there are these street swales in the upland area. And then what we're doing is we're using precast cells to create the sponge park. And they actually have little dividers in between them so the water can pass between the cells. And then there's this integrated sidewalk sedimentation basin, which will take all the cigarette butts and all the crud out of the water that's flowing down the street. And then there's a pedestrian path over a sand filter, and then there's a drain. And it's actually tying into an existing drain, not a new drain, important fact. So the water comes down the street, and some of it will be caught by the bioswale. And then it goes into this sedimentation basin, and this provides the important function of also distributing the water evenly to the different cells, because you don't want it to wash away, or some plants to get not enough water. And then it fills up, and then if we have a heavier rain, the water will go into the sand filter. Now we've designed it for the 1.2-inch storm, which is the state standard, but we also have a little bit of extra with this little sand filter feature. And the idea here is really that this is modular. It can be replicated more easily. Hopefully the next one won't take 8 years to do, right? And I think Emily Lloyd is really excited about putting sponge parks in all around the Gowanus. And once it's proven, then that'll be a lot easier point to sell, I think. And I think that's it. I think there's one more little view slide. But this is the current condition, and I actually want to keep the boat. What's happening with that? We'll have to find out in the Q&A from Owen. But this is the view of spring 2015. That's it. Thanks.